The city did not need bombs to burn. That is the first thing you need to understand about Tokyo in March 1945. Before the aircraft, before the fire, before the wind. The city already contained the conditions for its own destruction. Every structural characteristic of its urban fabric, the material of its buildings, the density of its residential districts, the geometry of its narrow streets, and the seasonal dryness of its air had converged into a single enormous quantity of fuel waiting for a sufficient ignition source. Tokyo in 1945 was not a modern Western city. It was not concrete and steel and wide avenues. It was wood. The residential districts that housed the majority of its 6 million inhabitants were constructed almost entirely from timber frames, paper walls, and thatch. Buildings stood 12 to 18 inches apart. Streets were 3 meters wide. A family's living space averaged less than 320 square feet. The average residential ward, the Chonakai districts that formed the city's social fabric, contained between 103,000 and 135,000 people per square mile. These numbers will matter enormously before this story ends. But the fire had not started yet, and the 334 aircraft were still hours away from their assembly points over the Mariana Islands. And the wind that would transform a bombing raid into something unprecedented in military history had not yet reached the coastal plains. Let's start at the beginning. Not with strategy, not with Curtis LeMay sitting in his headquarters on Guam recalculating targets, altitudes, and bomb loads. Not with the industrial logic of the air campaign against Japan, though that logic led directly and mechanically to what happened on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945. Let's start with what fire is. When fire encounters 103,000 people per square mile, when there is nowhere to go, when the streets are 3 meters wide, and when the wind is moving at 28 miles per hour. That is where this story lives. Tokyo sits on a coastal plain on the eastern edge of Honshu, Japan's main island. In early March, the prevailing winds off the Pacific interact with the seasonal pressure systems over the Japanese interior to produce a specific meteorological condition: dry, cold air moving at sustained speeds across a city that has received almost no rainfall in weeks. The Sumida River's floodplain, where the most densely packed residential wards were concentrated, funneled these winds between the elevation changes of the surrounding terrain, accelerating them through the low-lying areas like air through a bellows. The Meteorological Bureau recorded wind speeds of 22 to 28 miles per hour at surface level on the night of March 9, 1945. Those speeds, combined with the relative humidity of 15 to 20% in the surface air layers, produced conditions that a fire scientist would describe as catastrophic ignition probability. What that means, translated out of technical language, if something started burning in the residential districts under those conditions, it would not stop until it ran out of fuel or space. The city was the fuel. The wind was the mechanism. The 334 B-29 Superfortresses were the ignition source. General Curtis LeMay had made a series of calculations in the preceding weeks that his own staff considered reckless. The high-altitude daylight precision bombing that the 21st Bomber Command had been conducting against Japanese industrial targets since November 1944 was producing unacceptable results. Cloud cover over Japan averaged 70 to 80% of operational days. Jet stream winds at operational altitude, above 25,000 feet, reached 200 miles per hour, scattering bomb patterns across miles of target area. Industrial production had not decreased measurably. The campaign was consuming aircraft, fuel, and crews at a rate that Air Force logistics planners were quietly calculating as unsustainable. LeMay changed the approach entirely. He would send his aircraft in at night, at low altitude, between 4,900 and 9,200 feet, depending on wave position, stripped of most defensive armament to increase payload capacity, loaded with a specific mixture of incendiary munitions designed for wooden construction, against the residential areas that housed the workers who staffed the industrial facilities that precision daylight bombing could not reliably hit. The logic was brutally direct. If you cannot destroy the factories, you destroy the workforce. If precision targeting fails, you target the environment in which the target lives. The men who would fly this mission were not informed of the target until the afternoon of March 9th. When the curtain was pulled back in the briefing rooms on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, revealing the projected burn zone over Tokyo's most densely inhabited districts, the reaction was not enthusiasm.
Multiple aircrew accounts record the same response: silence. Then the specific kind of low conversation that happens when men understand what they are being asked to do. The mission would take them over heavily defended Japanese airspace. The low altitude made them visible, audible, and trackable by searchlights and anti-aircraft batteries.
They would be silhouetted against the fires their own first waves created. They would be flying, in the words of Bombardier Chester Marshall of the 504th Bomb Group, into a chimney. But the aircrew is not where this story ends.
The aircrew went home. Let us go down to the city. The residents of Tokyo's eastern wards had lived with the threat of air raids since 1942. They had dug shelters. They had organized neighborhood fire brigades. They had rehearsed bucket chain procedures. They had been told, repeatedly and officially, that civil defense preparations were adequate. The government's civil defense doctrine, informed by the experience of firebombing in Chinese cities during the Sino-Japanese War, prescribed sheltering in place, organized firefighting at the neighborhood level, and evacuation as a last resort.
None of these preparations have been designed for what a firestorm does to human physiology and decision-making. In the Asakusa, Honjo, and Fukagawa wards, the three most densely packed residential districts, and the ones that would absorb the first and heaviest concentrations of incendiaries, people were asleep when the air raid sirens began at 10:30. The M69 incendiary cluster bomb, which formed the primary munition of the Meetinghouse mission, was a device designed specifically for Japanese-style construction. Each M69 was a 6-pound tube filled with napalm, gelling gasoline developed specifically for its adhesive burning properties, with a contact fuse and a 3 to 5 second delay. Each parent bomb cluster contained 38 M69s. Each B-29 carried up to 40 clusters. The 334 aircraft of the Meetinghouse mission delivered approximately 1,665 tons of incendiaries over Tokyo's residential districts during a sustained 3-hour period beginning at midnight. Here is what the M69 does when it strikes a wooden building. The contact fuse fires. There is a delay of 3 to 5 seconds. Then the napalm ignites, burning at approximately 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and immediately begins adhering to whatever surface it has struck: wood, paper, thatch, cloth, skin. It cannot be brushed off. It cannot be smothered in the conventional sense because it carries its own oxidizer. Water reduces its temperature but does not extinguish it. The neighborhood fire brigades, which had trained for conventional fire suppression, encountered something their equipment and procedures had not been designed to address. Within 30 minutes of the first wave's release point, the Honjo ward was reporting 47 separate fire origins. The ward's fire brigade, 312 volunteers with 23 hand-pumped water wagons, was simultaneously attempting to respond to all of them. By the time the brigade leadership recognized that a coordinated response was impossible, the wind had already connected the separate fires into a continuous front.
A firestorm is not a large fire. That distinction matters. A firestorm is a meteorological event created by fire. When enough heat rises rapidly from a large burn area, it creates a low-pressure column above the fire that draws surface air inward from the surrounding area.
This inflow accelerates the combustion, which generates more heat, strengthening the low-pressure column, which draws in more air, in a self-reinforcing cycle that the fire itself maintains, regardless of external wind conditions.
The firestorm creates its own wind. In Tokyo, on the night of March 9 to 10, the external wind, already moving at 28 miles per hour, combined with the inflow winds of the developing firestorm to produce surface-level gusts that witnesses and survivors described as a horizontal roaring.
The temperature inside the fire column reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. At 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, wood does not require contact with flame to ignite. It reaches its auto-ignition temperature from radiant heat alone. Buildings across the street from burning buildings caught fire without the fire touching them.
The radiant heat was so intense that, according to survivor Masaya Enomoto, recorded in the Chu Award Oral History compilation assembled by the Tokyo Metropolitan Archives, you could feel your skin beginning to tighten and blister before you could see the flames clearly.
Your body was telling you something. The distance between you and the fire suggested was not yet possible. Auto-ignition at distance. This is what the neighborhood fire brigades had not been trained for.
This is why the bucket brigades, the shelter-in-place doctrine, and the organized civil defense procedures all failed simultaneously in every district within the first 40 minutes. The streets were 3 meters wide.
At 3 meters wide, a residential street in Honjo or Asakusa cannot contain a person fleeing in one direction while fire moves in another.
When the residents who had sheltered in their homes emerged, following the doctrine they had been taught, moving toward the designated community shelters, they found the streets already channeling fire and superheated air. The narrow geometry that had made these neighborhoods efficient for human habitation made them lethal for human evacuation.
A person's decision-making system, under conditions of extreme heat and smoke and the sound of a firestorm, is not the same cognitive tool that makes rational choices in normal environments. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, overrides prefrontal processing at a threshold of perceived danger that the firestorm exceeded by an enormous margin.
People did not make bad decisions that night. People's decision-making systems were functioning exactly as evolution designed them, which is to say, not for a firestorm. The flight response activates, the body moves toward perceived exits. When every exit channels the fire rather than away from it, the flight response drives people into the fire they are trying to escape. This is not a failure of courage. This is a failure of geometry. 3-meter streets in a firestorm, evacuation routes that were also inflow channels for the fire's own generated wind. Survivors, interviewed by historian Kenneth Werrell for his study Blankets of Fire, and by Mark Selden in his documentation of the Meetinghouse raid, describe the same sequence with a consistency that makes the account reliable across sources. Emergence from shelter, encounter with fire and smoke that blocked the intended route, decision to move toward water, the Sumida River, the Konda River, the canal network that divided the eastern districts, and the discovery that the canals were not sanctuaries. The water in the Sumida River's tributary canals heated to boiling in the areas where the fire had been most intense. This is documented in the official report of the Tokyo Fire Department's post-raid analysis, which was conducted under the direction of the occupation authorities in 1946 and archived in the Tokyo Metropolitan Fire Museum.
Canal water temperature measurements taken from areas within the burn zone 2 days after the raid recorded residual temperatures of 60 to 70 degrees Celsius in enclosed canal sections. The water had been hotter during the raid itself.
People who had entered the canals seeking refuge from the heat had been boiled. The ones who survived the canals were those who kept their heads above the surface and accepted the burns from radiant heat on exposed skin as the price of avoiding immersion in water that had become lethal.
This is not a metaphor. This is the specific calculation that survival in a firestorm reduces human experience to. Which of the available forms of death is the slowest, and is that speed sufficient for the fire to pass?
Let me show you what the air crew experienced, because it is its own kind of hellscape. The B-29 Superfortress at 5,000 feet over a firestorm is not the same aircraft it is at 25,000 feet above cloud cover. The turbulence generated by the rising heat column threw 70-ton aircraft upward by hundreds of feet in seconds. Tail gunner Henry Irwin, who would receive the Medal of Honor for a separate act of extraordinary courage on a later mission, described the low-altitude incendiary runs in terms that his debrief records show were replicated by dozens of other crew members. The aircraft did not feel controlled. It felt like something the fire was doing with. The smell entered the aircraft through the pressurization systems. The smoke from 16 square miles of burning residential construction, wood, paper, human material, penetrated the crew compartments. Multiple crew accounts record vomiting from the smell alone. Navigator Donald Gilger, whose account is preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency records at Maxwell Air Force Base, wrote that the smell was identifiable and that identifying it was the worst part of the mission. He did not specify further.
He did not need to. The aircrew also encountered something the mission planners had not fully accounted for. The B-29s flying over the burn zone were silhouetted against their own fires from below, visible to anti-aircraft batteries tracking them against the orange light the city was producing. Of the 334 aircraft dispatched, 14 were lost and 42 sustained significant damage, a loss rate of 4.2% on the aircraft that flew, higher than the 2.9% average for the preceding high-altitude daylight campaign.
The low altitude that made the raid more effective against wooden construction also made it more dangerous for the crews conducting it.
The last wave of B-29s crossed the Sumida River estuary at 3 a.m. The mission's 3-hour bombing window closed. The aircraft turned southeast, toward the Mariana Islands and their airfields.
They were 7 hours and 45 minutes from landing. The fire was not over. A firestorm does not stop when the ignition source stops. It stops when it exhausts its fuel.
Tokyo's eastern residential districts were 99.3% wooden construction. Once the firestorm had developed fully, it burned through them with a completeness that the raid's planners had modeled statistically, but that no statistical model adequately conveys.
By 9 a.m. on March 10, the fire had consumed 15.8 square miles of the city. The area encompassed the Asakusa, Honjo, Fukagawa, Shitaya, Koto, and portions of 6 additional wards.
The city's official death toll, compiled by the Tokyo Metropolitan Police and later revised by independent researchers, recorded 83,793 confirmed dead, bodies recovered and identified.
The estimate of unrecovered dead, those incinerated completely, those whose bodies entered the river and bay, those not yet discovered in the ash, ranged from 40,000 to 100,000 additional casualties in the analyses conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey in 1946. The total death toll of the Meetinghouse raid, between 80,000 and 100,000 people in a single night, depending on the source methodology. The Hiroshima atomic bombing killed between 70,000 and 80,000 people immediately.
Nagasaki killed between 40,000 and 50,000 people immediately. Operation Meetinghouse was the deadliest air raid in military history. This fact is not widely known.
The 2 atomic bombings exist in the historical memory of World War II on a scale that the Meetinghouse raid does not, despite killing more people in a single night than either of them.
The reasons for this asymmetry of historical memory are themselves worth examination. The atomic bombings produced a new category of weapon and a new strategic reality. They required explanation in terms of what they represented for the future of warfare. The Meetinghouse raid was accomplished with existing technology, aircraft, incendiaries, meteorological calculation, which made it not a new strategic threshold, but an extremely efficient application of existing methods. The bomb that destroys a city is historically memorable as a new thing. The fire that destroys a city, even if it kills more people, is historically less memorable because it does not introduce a new category.
There is also the question of what was destroyed. The atomic bombings left identifiable epicenters. The hypocenter markers in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are physical locations, permanent references, places where memory has been organized and institutionalized. The Meetinghouse burn zone left 15.8 square miles of bare earth.
When Reconstruction came, and it came rapidly, under the pressure of a displaced population and occupation authority priorities, the ash was built over. There were no ruins preserved. There was nothing to visit. The physical absence of ruins contributed to a cultural absence of memory.
The Yokoami-cho Park in Sumida Ward contains the Tokyo Metropolitan Consolation for the War Dead, which memorializes the victims of both the March 10th raid and the firebombing campaign generally, but it does not have the institutional or international recognition of the atomic bomb memorial sites.
The Meetinghouse dead are counted, documented, and mourned, but the event does not hold the same scale of ongoing historical engagement. However, we are still not at the end of this story.
We are not at the end because the fire's most important effects were not the deaths it caused on the night of March 9th to 10.
The fire's most important effects were what it did to the people who lived, what survival of a firestorm does to a human being's relationship with the world, with enclosed spaces, with the smell of combustion, with wind. Let me show you what 1945 Tokyo produced in its survivors.
A firestorm survivor is not a person who was in a dangerous situation and escaped. A firestorm survivor is a person who processed, through every available sensory system, an environment in which the normal rules of matter and physics were operating at extremes their nervous systems had not been designed to accommodate.
The heat was visible. The sound was physically painful at close range. The combined roar of superheated air, collapsing structures, and fire-generated wind reached 120 decibels in areas near the burn front, a level associated with immediate auditory damage and, at sustained exposure, with the kind of acoustic trauma that does not resolve. The light from the fire was visible from 150 miles at sea. The color was not the orange of a campfire or a house fire. Witnesses on ships in Tokyo Bay described it as white at the center and orange at the margins, shifting with the fire's intensity in patterns that did not behave like normal light sources, because a firestorm column is not a normal light source. It is a thermal column hot enough to radiate in the visible spectrum from its own heat, independent of the combustion happening at its base. Survivors who made it through the night carried these sensory records into the rest of their lives. This is not metaphor or poetry. This is how memory and trauma encoding work. Extreme sensory experiences, processed under conditions of extreme threat, are stored in a way that can be re-triggered by any element of the original experience, even decades later, even in contexts that are objectively safe.
Testimony collected by historian Yuki Tanaka from Meetinghouse survivors for Japan's Comfort Women and Firebombing, and the separate testimony archived in the Japanese language records of the Center for Research and Documentation on Japan's War Responsibility, document a pattern that appears consistently across accounts spanning the 1960s through the 1990s: the smell of smoke.
The sound of wind at a certain speed, the sight of a red or orange light at night, the sudden sense in an enclosed space of insufficient air because the firestorm had burned oxygen from the air in low-lying areas, and survivors' lungs had encoded the specific sensation of hypoxic air as survival-critical information. Setsuko Iwamoto, whose account appears in the oral history collection Tokyo Daikushu, compiled by the Showa-kan National Showa Memorial Museum, described waking for years afterward from the sound of wind. Not unusual wind, not storm-level wind. The kind of wind that moved through an open window at night in spring, approximately the speed of a fan on low setting, approximately the speed of air movement that in Tokyo in March 1945 had been the physical mechanism by which the fire had spread from building to building through her neighborhood before dawn. Her nervous system did not distinguish between the wind that killed her neighbors and the wind that moved through her apartment 40 years later. The nervous system does not care about the objective safety of the present moment. It cares about pattern recognition. This sensory input was present when everything was burning, so this sensory input means everything may be burning. This is what survival costs. Not the night itself, though the night costs everything the night costs. But the nights afterward, for the rest of a life, when the normal world triggers the recorded world, and the person who survived a firestorm is required to explain to their nervous system that the open window is not 1945, and the wind is not moving at 28 miles per hour over wood and paper and 103,000 people per square mile. Some of them could do this. Some of them found words and made the explanation work. Some of them sat in the dark until the nervous system returned to baseline on its own. None of them ever smelt smoke the same way again. This is documented too often across too many survivor accounts to be coincidence.
The olfactory processing of smoke, any smoke, had been permanently recoded through its association with the most extreme event their biology had ever recorded. Kitchen smoke, incense, a cigarette across a room.
The neurological response was disproportionate to the present stimulus and proportional to the original one, because the brain stores sensory emotional associations not by later reassessment, but by the emotional weight of the original registration. The Meetinghouse raid killed between 80,000 and 100,000 people. It displaced 1,008,000.
The United States Strategic Bombing Survey's final report on the Japan campaign, published in 1947, noted that the destruction of Tokyo's working-class residential districts reduced Tokyo's industrial workforce by a percentage sufficient to materially degrade production at facilities that precision bombing had not been able to touch directly, not because the workers were dead, but because they were displaced, homeless, and spending their working hours on survival rather than production. The bomber's effect extends beyond its blast radius. This was LeMay's calculation, and the Strategic Bombing Survey confirmed it as valid.
But the calculation was conducted in aggregate, because at the scale of 83,793 confirmed dead and 1,008,000 displaced, no other form of calculation is operationally possible. The aggregate is the only tool that functions at that scale. The aggregate does not record what happened to Setsuko Iwamoto's relationship with wind.
The aggregate does not record the 40-year career of a Hanjo Ward survivor who became a factory worker in Osaka in 1946, who worked without interruption until his mandatory retirement in 1981, who never told his co-workers what he had seen, who had developed over 36 years the specific skill of excusing himself to a bathroom or an exterior stairwell when he needed to wait for his nervous system to return to baseline after a smell or a sound triggered what had been recorded on March 10, 1945.
The aggregate cannot hold what individual experience contains. This is always true in every war, in every disaster.
But the gap between the aggregate and the individual is especially acute in Tokyo in March 1945, because the aggregate is so large, 83,793 confirmed dead in a single night, that the individual has essentially no statistical presence within it. The individual's entire experience, the specific geometry of their escape route, the specific canal they entered or avoided, the specific moment they understood that the neighborhood they had lived in for 40 years had ceased to exist, counts for exactly 0.0012% of the confirmed dead count. And the confirmed dead count does not include the 1,008,000 displaced, among whom the individual survivor with their recorded smell response and their wind-triggered nervous system is an even smaller fraction. This is what scale does to individual experience, not just in history books, not just in strategic surveys, in the lived reality of every Meetinghouse survivor who existed after March 10, 1945, as a person whose experience was both total and statistically invisible. The last thing I want to tell you about this raid is something the history books almost never include. The spring of 1945 in Tokyo was warm. By late March, by April, the cherry blossoms came. The Hanami season, the tradition of viewing cherry blossoms in parks and along riverbanks, arrived on its normal schedule, regardless of what the eastern wards of the city looked like.
And in the western wards, in the neighborhoods that the fire had not reached, people went to see the blossoms on their normal schedule, because life continues on its own schedule regardless of catastrophe, because the parts of the city that were not ash were still the parts of the city where people lived. The eastern wards produced no Hanami that spring. The Sumida River embankment, which had been one of Tokyo's most celebrated viewing sites, was bare. The trees along the Kondo River in Asakusa were gone. The parks where neighborhood associations had gathered for the annual viewing ceremony were ash or rubble.
By April 1945, in the western residential districts within walking distance of the burn zone, the most common sensory description in the diary entries and letters that have been archived, the ones that survived the war and were collected for the historical record, was the smell of ash on the warm spring wind.
They could not get away from it. The city that was still there smelled like the city that was not there anymore. The spring air carried it. The same meteorological system that had driven the fire through the eastern wards in March now carried what remained of them westward in April, over the people who had not been displaced, over the parks where they could not have Hanami because the trees were gone. The spring smelled like the raid.
For years, the diary entries continue through the occupation period, through the late 1940s, and a handful run into the 1950s.
The first warm spring wind carried a trace of what had happened. The city was rebuilding. The reconstruction was rapid, determined, and visible. But the first spring wind came from the east, and the east was where 15.8 square miles had been reduced to mineral ash, and some of that ash had not gone anywhere.
Some of it was still in the soil. Some of it was in the river silt. Some of it was in the lungs of people who breathed Tokyo's spring air for the rest of the 1940s and could not fully identify why the smell of a warm day made something in them respond before they had consciously processed what the smell was. This is the ending of the story of the deadliest air raid in history.
Not the strategic outcome, which was confirmed by the Strategic Bombing Survey in 1947. Not the tactical innovation, which LeMay applied to 66 additional Japanese cities before the war ended. Not the political decision, which has been analyzed and debated in the academic literature for 80 years. The ending is a spring wind carrying ash.
The ending is Satsuko Iwamoto, decades later, in an apartment with an open window, waiting for her nervous system to understand that the wind was not from 1945. The ending is what some environments do to people that does not end when the environment does.
Here is my question for you. We talk about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the defining moments of the air war against Japan, the events that ended the war, the events that introduced the nuclear age, the events that history organized itself around remembering.
But the deadliest single night of aerial bombardment in the history of warfare happened 5 months earlier, killed more people in a single night than either atomic bombing, and is almost completely absent from popular historical memory. Why do we remember the events that changed strategy and forget the events that killed the most people?
Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this changed how you think about what happened over Japan in 1945, hit that like button and subscribe for more military history that goes deeper than the standard narrative. There is more of this, the stories that are buried under the ones we already know. Thanks for watching.